May 16th, 1943. North Atlantic Ocean. Kapitän Leutnant Werner Henke is reading a signal from BDU, U-boat command, that confirms what he already knows from the wreckage floating past his periscope. Something has changed in the Atlantic, and it has changed in a way that is going to kill most of the men he knows. Henke commands U-515, a Type 1XC submarine of the 10th U-boat flotilla, currently on patrol in the central Atlantic in what German Naval Command calls the Black Gap, the stretch of ocean beyond the reach of land-based Allied air cover, where, until very recently, U-boats have been able to operate with relative freedom against the convoy routes connecting America to Britain. He has been at sea for 23 days, on a patrol whose duration and operational area reflect the Type 1XC's specific extended range capability that has been the primary tactical advantage of the long-range U-boats over the shorter-range Type 6 that constitute the bulk of the German submarine fleet and that have been operating primarily in the North Atlantic convoy lanes. The Type 1XC can reach the central Atlantic, operate there for weeks, and return with sufficient fuel, a capability that has been the operational foundation of the Central Atlantic campaign and that the Black Gap's absence of air cover has been making profitable. He has attacked 2 convoys and sunk 3 ships. He is, by the metrics that BDU applies to its commanders, gross tonnage sunk per patrol, number of convoys attacked, accuracy of BDU coordination signals sent, performing at a level that the U-boat arm's operational culture rewards with the Knight's Cross that he will eventually receive, and with the professional reputation that the U-boat arm's specific warrior culture creates around its most effective practitioners. The BDU signal he is reading on May 16 is not about this performance, but the BDU signal he is reading on May 16 is not a signal about his performance. It is a signal about the performance of the convoy escorts that he has been encountering on this patrol. Escorts that are different from the British destroyers and corvettes that his training and his experience have prepared him to evade. There are new ships in the water. Small relative to the fleet destroyers that the convoy escort has been built around. 306 feet, compared to the fleet destroyers' 376 feet. But fast and purpose-built for the specific mission of finding and killing submarines, with a combination of ASDIC, radar, and depth charge capability that the German naval intelligence system has been tracking with increasing professional alarm since the first examples appeared with convoy escort groups in the spring of 1943. They are American. They are destroyer escorts. The DE class that the United States Navy has been designing since 1941 in response to the British experience of the early Atlantic campaign and producing in the American industrial system's specific and characteristic way, which is to say, in quantities that exceed what any prior assessment of American naval production capacity has projected as achievable on the timeline being achieved. There are 563 of them in the construction pipeline, being built in shipyards from Boston to San Francisco, on a production schedule whose monthly output is increasing as the assembly lines achieve their design throughput. Henke does not know this number. What he knows is that the ships he is encountering are different, and that the difference has consequences. Henke does not know this number. What he knows is that the ships he is encountering are different, and that the difference is being recorded in his Kriegstagebücher, his war diary, with the professional precision that the U-boat arms documentation culture requires, and with the private professional alarm that the documentation culture permits in the KTB's technical assessment sections in ways that the public communications through BDU do not permit. The KTB is honest in the specific way that operational military documentation must be honest if the operation it documents is to function. Inaccuracies in the KTB produce inaccurate assessments at BDU, and inaccurate assessments at BDU produce operational plans built on false premises and tactical guidance that sends submarines to their deaths based on incorrect understanding of what they are facing. The KTB is therefore not just honest. It is professionally required to be honest, in the specific and functional sense that professional military documentation, whose purpose is operational improvement, must contain accurate information about what the operational environment actually is. and the KTB is the document that the U-boat commander writes for the operational record rather than for morale or for political requirement. And when Henke and his peers in the spring and summer of 1943 write about the American destroyer Escorts in their KTBs, they are writing something that the history of the Battle of the Atlantic has been preserving in the German naval archives and the British intelligence captures for 8 decades. The honest professional assessment of men who understand that what they are encountering is the specific instrument of their destruction, described with the technical precision of men who have trained their whole professional lives to understand exactly what each aspect of an anti-submarine weapon system means for the probability that they will surface from their next dive. The Battle of the Atlantic in the spring of 1943 is at a turning point that neither side's public communication fully captures, but that both sides' professional military intelligence is assessing with the specific and concentrated attention of men who understand that the battle's outcome will determine whether Germany can sustain the strategic pressure on Britain's supply lines that Dönitz's operational theory has always identified as the war's decisive theater. The U-boat arm has been producing, in the 6 months preceding May 1943, results that BDU's operational assessment describes as approaching the threshold at which the campaign's strategic goal, the interdiction of British supply at a rate sufficient to force Britain out of the war, might be achievable. November 1942 through March 1943 has produced the highest Allied merchant shipping losses of the entire war, with 108 ships sunk in March 1943 alone, a rate that Churchill privately describes to his war cabinet as the most dangerous period of the entire conflict. The wolfpack tactics that Dönitz has been refining since 1939, the coordinated attacks of multiple submarines on a single convoy, directed by BDU from shore, using the encoded radio traffic that the U-boats generate throughout the Atlantic, and that BDU has been confident is secure in the Enigma machine's encryption, whose breaking by the British cryptographic effort at Bletchley Park remains unknown to the German Naval Command, are working at a rate that the available Allied escorts, mostly converted destroyers, and the Flower-class corvettes, whose anti-submarine capabilities are real, but whose speed and sensor systems have been falling behind the tactical demands of convoy protection against the Wolfpack's coordinated multi-directional attacks, cannot adequately counter. The convoys are being found because the U-boat's Enigma-encoded radio traffic is being decoded at Bletchley Park, and the convoy routes are being adjusted in response to U-boat deployment signals. But the adjustment is incomplete, and the U-boats are finding enough convoys to produce the loss rates that Churchill is reporting to his war cabinet as the campaign's most dangerous period. The escort forces need help. The help is being built in American shipyards. Then everything changes. It changes because of the Black Gap, and it changes because of the ships that close it. And it changes in a span of weeks in the spring and summer of 1943 that the naval historians will call the turn of the tide, and that the U-boat commanders experience in the specific and personal form of patrol reports that document losses at rates the force has not previously sustained. In May 1943 alone, the German U-boat arm loses 41 submarines. 41 submarines in 31 days, more than in any previous month of the entire war. More than the replacement pipeline can address, at the pace it has been producing new boats. More than the training program can replace with the experienced crews that the lost submarines have taken to the bottom of the Atlantic. BDU receives the patrol reports of the surviving boats with the professional attention of an operational headquarters that has been tracking the monthly loss rates since the campaign began, and that knows, with the specific arithmetic of a campaign whose losses are beginning to exceed its production and its training pipeline's replacement capacity, what a loss rate of this magnitude means for the operational future of the force. Grand Admiral Dönitz, commanding the submarine force and the German Navy, withdraws the Wolfpacks from the North Atlantic on May 24, 1943. Not because the strategic objective has changed, but because the tactical environment in which the campaign has been fought no longer supports the operations whose losses are exceeding their results. The withdrawal is called temporary. The conditions that made the North Atlantic viable for Wolfpack operations do not return. The Black Gap is closed by 2 instruments: whose combination produces the specific and decisive reversal of the Atlantic campaign's fortunes that May 1943 represents in the naval historical record. The first is the long-range aircraft, the very long-range B-24 Liberators that Coastal Command finally receives in adequate numbers in early 1943, following the specific and extended argument between Coastal Command and the RAF's Bomber Command over the allocation of the aircraft that both services want for their respective missions, and that the Atlantic campaign's escalating convoy losses have eventually resolved in Coastal Command's favor. The Liberators begin providing air cover over the previously uncovered Central Atlantic, closing the 500-mile gap in air coverage that the wolfpacks have been exploiting with the operational freedom of men who understand that their primary vulnerability, the aircraft overhead that forces them to dive and lose their convoy contact and their ability to coordinate with the other submarines in their pack, is not present in this specific stretch of ocean. The second is the escort carrier and its accompanying destroyer escorts, the American hunter-killer groups that the United States Navy begins deploying in mid-1943 around the small carriers that bring the air coverage to the convoys they escort, and that represent the specific and decisive American industrial contribution to the Atlantic campaign's resolution, the capacity to produce, in large numbers and on a compressed timeline, the specialized vessels whose combination of capability and quantity is required to close the tactical gap that the Wolfpack's coordinated attack methodology has opened in the Allied convoy defense. Destroyer escorts are not fleet destroyers. They are not the large, fast, torpedo-armed warships that the destroyer classification implies to a naval officer of 1943. They are purpose-built anti-submarine vessels whose design has been optimized for the specific and singular mission of finding and killing submarines, at the specific cost of the fleet destroyer's speed and torpedo armament and gun armament, in exchange for the enhanced sonar systems and the larger depth charge capacity and the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars, whose forward-firing pattern addresses the specific tactical weakness of the stern-dropping depth charge pattern that submarines have been exploiting since the First World War. The destroyer escort is not a compromise between anti-surface and anti-submarine capability, not the result of a design process that has tried to build a vessel capable of both missions and has succeeded at neither to the degree that either mission's specialist vessel would achieve. It is a choice, the deliberate sacrifice of general naval warfare capability for the maximum possible anti-submarine capability within the size and speed constraints that the convoy escort mission's operational demands impose. The choice is made in Washington in 1941 by the Naval Design Bureaus working with the specific operational data that the British experience of Atlantic convoy warfare has been providing since 1939, and it produces a vessel whose specifications are the specifications of the anti-submarine mission rather than the specifications of the general-purpose naval combatant. Speed, 24 knots, enough to catch a surface submarine, but not enough to operate with fleet destroyers in surface action. Armament, 3-inch guns, adequate for surface and air defense, but not for destroyer-on-destroyer combat, paired with the Hedgehog mortar and the large stern depth charge racks that are the DE's primary offensive weapons. Sensor suite, the SQS-4 sonar system whose active ranging capability and passive listening capability exceed the anti-submarine sensor suite of any previous convoy escort in the Allied inventory, paired with the SL radar system, whose centimetric wavelength provides submarine detection capability at ranges and in sea states that the metric wavelength radar of the earlier convoy escorts cannot match. The destroyer escort is the vessel whose design brief has been written by the Atlantic convoy's accumulated experience of what kills submarines, and whose every design choice has been made in the service of that brief, rather than of any other naval mission. And it is built in numbers that only the American industrial system, operating under the specific organizational acceleration that the War Production Board's allocation of shipyard capacity to destroyer escort construction has produced, can deliver on the timeline that the Atlantic campaign's mid-1943 crisis requires. May 24th, 1943. Captain Lieutenant Hartwig Lux of U-264 is in the North Atlantic at grid reference AK-9753, in position to attack a convoy that his BDU-assigned wolfpack has been tracking for 2 days. He surfaces to send his sighting report and to maneuver into attack position, and finds himself in the presence of a destroyer escort whose radar has already identified his surfacing. What happens in the next 40 minutes is what the U-boat commanders who survive it are going to write about in their KTBs with the specific precision of men who have been in mortal danger and who have survived by the narrowest available margin. The destroyer escorts approach, using the radar contact to close on the U-boat at a speed that the U-boat's surface speed cannot match, so that the dive that is Lux's only option, once the destroyer escort is within visual range, is a dive made under attack rather than before it, with the U-boat's hull in the water and the conning tower still visible when the first patterns begin landing. The depth charges are Hedgehog rounds, the British-developed, American-manufactured forward-firing contact-fused projectiles that land in a circular pattern ahead of the attacking vessel rather than astern, and that detonate on contact with the submarine's hull rather than at a preset depth, so that the absence of a detonation is itself the evidence of a miss rather than of an incorrect depth setting. Lux takes U-264 to 200 meters and begins the evasive maneuvering that his training has prepared him for. The course changes, the speed variations, the silent running protocols that minimize the acoustic signature that the attacker's ASDIC is tracking. The depth charges follow him down, not with the approximation that earlier British depth charge attacks have produced against submarines executing evasion patterns at depth, but with an accuracy that his KTB attributes to the attacker's sonar being better than anything he has previously encountered, tracking him through the evasive maneuvers with a persistence that the evasive maneuvers are not breaking the contact of. He eventually escapes. The KTB entry for May 24th is meticulous. It describes the attack with the technical precision of a man who has been trained to document exactly what happened, and it attributes the attack's accuracy and persistence to equipment and crew quality that the German naval intelligence has not fully characterized. He writes that the new escorts are better than what preceded them. He writes that they are specifically better in their sonar, the active ASDIC returns maintaining contact through course changes at depth that the previous generation of convoy escorts would have lost, and in the coordination between the attacking vessels in the group, which operates with a thoroughness of communication that suggests a command and sensor system whose integration exceeds what previous convoy escorts have demonstrated in the persistent and methodical way that a force that has been specifically trained and organized for the anti-submarine mission demonstrates when the anti-submarine mission is all it has been designed to perform. The earlier convoy escorts were general-purpose destroyers performing anti-submarine work as one of several missions. These are ships for which anti-submarine work is the only mission, crewed by men who have been trained for nothing else, organized in groups whose coordination procedures have been developed from the specific operational experience of what works in the prosecution of a U-boat contact and what does not. He does not know what he is describing is an American weapons system developed specifically to outclass what his submarine's evasion doctrine has been successful against. He knows what it is doing. The KTB records what it does. June 4, 1943. Kapitänleutnant Wilhelm von Massenhausen and U-105 are operating with wolfpack Trutz against convoy HX-239 in the Central Atlantic. The convoy has a support group, not merely the immediate escort of corvettes and destroyers, but a separate hunter-killer group built around the escort carrier USS Bogue and her accompanying destroyer escorts, operating ahead and to the flanks of the convoy's route to sanitize the area of submarines before the convoy reaches it. This is new. This is operationally new in a way that the individual quality of the destroyer escorts does not fully capture, because the hunter-killer group concept is not merely a better anti-submarine vessel. It is a different operational concept whose logic has changed from reactive to proactive. The previous convoy escort model has been reactive. The escorts accompany the convoy, and when a submarine attacks, The escorts respond to the attack. The hunter-killer group is proactive. It operates independently of the convoy, hunting submarines in the convoy's approach area, and the submarine that is maneuvering to attack the convoy must first survive a hunter-killer group that has been sent out specifically to find it before it can reach the convoy's vicinity. Von Massenhausen's KTB for June 4 documents his encounter with the Bogue group with the professional frustration of a man who has been trained to attack convoys and whose tactical training has prepared him for the escort force as the specific tactical problem that stands between him and the merchant ships he is supposed to be sinking, but who is instead being intercepted before he can reach the convoy by a force whose operational concept his training has not prepared him to counter. The previous operational experience that has built the German submarine force's tactical doctrine has been built around the escort force as a reactive opponent, a force that is present with the convoy, responds to attacks on the convoy, and prosecutes submarine contacts identified in the process of defending the convoy from attack. The doctrine for evading this reactive opponent is built on the assumption that the submarine can maneuver to the convoy's flank or ahead of the convoy and attack from a position that the escort has not specifically prepared to defend, because the escort force's primary orientation is toward the convoy it is protecting, rather than toward the broader area in which submarines might be approaching. The hunter-killer group destroys this assumption. The hunter-killer group is not oriented toward the convoy. It is oriented toward the submarine. Its mission is not to defend the convoy from attack, but to find submarines in the convoy's approach area and sink them before they can reach attack position. And the operational consequence of this orientation is that the submarine that has been maneuvering toward the convoy in the specific and trained way that the old convoy escort model has been the opponent of, is now being found by a force that is looking for it rather than waiting for it to announce itself by attacking. He is forced to dive by an Avenger aircraft from the Bogue, the Grumman TBF carrier aircraft that is operating in the anti-submarine role, with radar and depth charges, and the ability to vector the surface escorts to his position through the radio communication that the air-surface coordination system, the hunter-killer group practices, has made instantaneous rather than approximate. He goes deep, below 150 meters, below the depth at which the destroyer escort's depth charges are set to detonate, in the cold and pressure-heavy water where the submarine's hull creaks under the stress of the depth, and where the sound of the propellers above is the sound of a machine that is very specifically trying to kill him. He evades, running at slow speed to reduce his acoustic signature, changing course every 5 minutes in the pattern that his training has established as the most effective counter to ASDIC tracking. He eventually reaches the surface and sends a contact report to BDU. But the convoy has passed while he was being held down by the hunter-killer group's relentless prosecution of his position, and when he reaches the convoy's track, the convoy is gone, and the destroyer escorts are still present. His KTB entry describes the day as consumed in evasion rather than attack, an inversion of the operational relationship between the U-boat and the convoy escort that his professional experience has established as the correct relationship. The near failure in his own operational record is the near failure of the entire German submarine campaign in miniature. The submarine that can no longer reach the target because the escort has changed from a reactive defender to a proactive hunter. The near failure in the Allied anti-submarine campaign, the operational development that comes closest to extending the German U-boat arm's effective operational period beyond the spring of 1943, and to delaying the decisive shift that the destroyer escorts and the escort carriers eventually produce. The development whose resolution in the direction of adequate resource allocation has been far from inevitable, given the institutional pressures pushing in the opposite direction, arrives not in any tactical engagement at sea, but in the specific and documented controversy over the allocation of long-range aircraft to Coastal Command that Churchill has been fighting with the RAF and with the American Air Forces through 1942 and into 1943. Bomber Command wants the liberators for the strategic bombing campaign that Harris has been conducting against German cities and German industrial infrastructure. The The American 8th Air Force wants them for its own strategic bombing operations over Germany. Coastal Command, representing the Atlantic campaign's requirement for very long-range maritime patrol aircraft, is arguing against two institutional constituencies with significant political weight and a strategic theory whose appeal to the political leadership's desire for an offensive alternative to the grinding and costly defensive struggle of the Atlantic is powerful and specific. The argument that the strategic bombing campaign will win the war by destroying German industrial capacity is an argument whose logic is compelling and whose evidence is ambiguous, and the ambiguity allows the bombing campaign's advocates to resist the reallocation of their aircraft to the Atlantic's defensive requirement longer than the Atlantic campaign's casualty rate justifies. If the very long-range aircraft arrive 6 months earlier, the black gap closes 6 months earlier. The hunter-killer groups have air cover for their operations 6 months earlier, and the toll on the U-boats that May and June 1943 inflict might have been inflicted in November and December 1942, in the specific period when the U-boat successes were highest and the convoy losses most severe. The controversy is resolved in the direction of allocating the aircraft, and the resolution comes in early 1943, in time to contribute to the May reversal. But the 6 months during which it is not resolved are 6 months in which the convoys continue losing ships at rates that the resolution would have reduced. And the men who lose their lives in those 6 months are the specific human cost of the institutional delay in recognizing that the Atlantic campaign required the air resources that the strategic bombing campaign's advocates had been diverting from it. By September 1943, the KTBs of the U-boat commanders who are still operating in the Atlantic, a cohort reduced by approximately 60% from its spring 1943 strength by the losses of the summer, contain assessments of the American destroyer escorts and escort carriers that constitute the most honest professional evaluation of an opponent's system that the German naval archives preserve from any phase of the Second World War. The assessments are consistent across the surviving KTBs in their specific technical observations. The destroyer escort's sonar is better than what preceded it, specifically in its ability to maintain contact through evasive maneuvers at depth. The radar coverage from the escort carrier's aircraft is continuous rather than intermittent, removing the surfacing windows that the previous convoy escort pattern's limited air coverage had left available. And the coordination between air and surface elements of the hunter-killer groups reflects a command and communication system whose integration is producing a combined anti-submarine capability that exceeds the sum of its component parts in exactly the way that the U-boat arm's own wolfpack coordination has been exceeding the sum of individual U-boat capabilities. The assessments are also consistent in their implicit conclusion. Implicit because KTBs are operational documents rather than strategic assessments, and because the German naval command system in 1943 does not invite operational reports that announce the strategic defeat of the campaign they are reporting on, but implicit in a way that the specific technical observations make unmistakable to anyone reading the accumulated KTBs of September 1943 against the KTBs of September 1943. The operational environment in which the U-boat arm achieved its 1942 and early 1943 successes no longer exists. The specific vulnerabilities in the Allied convoy defense system that wolfpack tactics have been exploiting, the gap in air coverage, the inadequacy of the convoy escort's sonar at depth and speed, the reactive orientation of the escort force that the wolfpack's coordinated approach has been finding ways around, have been closed by the American industrial production of the destroyer escorts and escort carriers, and the operational doctrine that has been designed to employ them. The closing has been rapid. The technology has arrived on a timeline that German naval intelligence has not projected as achievable. A timeline produced by the American industrial system's capacity for high-volume specialized production that German naval strategic planning has always known would eventually be decisive, and has always calculated would be decisive too late. The calculation has been wrong. The timeline is now, and the U-boat commanders writing their KTBs in September 1943 are writing the documentation of what too late looks like from the inside. The professional record of an operational force that has encountered the specific instrument of its own defeat and is recording the encounter with the meticulous accuracy that its professional culture has always required. The KTBs do not say that the war is lost. Operational war diaries do not make strategic assessments, and the men writing the September 1943 KTBs are doing so with the professional discipline of officers who have been trained to document what they observe rather than what they conclude about the strategic implications of what they observe, leaving the strategic conclusions to the operational headquarters, whose role it is to assemble the individual patrol reports into the comprehensive picture of the campaign's status that BDU's operational analysis is performing in Lorient. The strategic assessment that BDU's September 1943 analysis produces, that the North Atlantic campaign cannot be resumed on the terms that made it productive without a fundamental change in the technological balance of the anti-submarine contest, is the assessment that Dönitz takes to the German High Command with the specific professional courage of a naval officer delivering a strategic finding that contradicts the strategic assumptions that the High Command has been planning on. But they say, with the specific and documentable precision of professional military documentation, that the conditions under which strategic success was approaching have been permanently changed by something that has arrived in quantities and with a quality that the available German defensive technology and operational doctrine cannot counter. What the German U-boat commanders wrote when the American destroyer Escorts started appearing in the KTBs that the German Naval Archive preserves and that the British intelligence system captured and analyzed in real time, and that historians have been reading since the archives were opened, is not primarily a story about fear, though the fear is present in the specific and professional way that men who understand the probability of death describe it, as the relevant probability in the technical assessment of what has just happened and what is likely to happen next. It is primarily a story about the recognition of a qualitative change in the opposition, the recognition that the specific and industrial quality of the American weapons system that is appearing in the Atlantic in mid-1943 represents not an incremental improvement in convoy defense, but a discontinuous change in the effectiveness of the anti-submarine campaign, produced by the application of American industrial capacity to a specifically designed weapons system on a production timeline that German naval intelligence has not projected as achievable. The destroyer Escort is what winning an industrial war looks like from the losing side. It is the visible and floating evidence, present in the convoy support groups, present in the hunter-killer formations hunting submarines away from the convoy routes, present in the shipyards, where the 563rd destroyer Escort is being assembled on the same production line that produced the first. Of the specific and structural American capacity for the application of industrial production to military requirements that the German strategic planning had always known would eventually arrive and had always calculated would arrive too late. The German calculation was built on the assumption that the strategic campaign could be brought to its decisive outcome, the interdiction of British supply at rates that British resilience could not sustain, before American industrial production could change the terms of the campaign's operational equation. The calculation was wrong in a specific and documentable way. It underestimated the American production timeline and overestimated the German strategic timeline. The American production arrived. The German strategic outcome did not. It did not arrive too late. It arrived in May 1943, and the U-boat commanders who encountered it wrote down what they found in the meticulous and honest documentation of men whose professional culture has always required the accurate recording of what the sea delivers. And what the sea delivered in May 1943 was the specific and industrial form of their own strategic defeat. New ships, in new numbers, with new sensors, operated by men who had been specifically trained to kill them, and who were succeeding, whose training and whose technology and whose industrial backing had been assembled specifically to produce this outcome in this ocean at this moment, and who were finding the submarines and sinking them at the rate that the production of 563 destroyer escorts makes possible, when each one is doing the job it was built to do.